Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Peter O'Donoghue and Deshawn Bell of the company Tyto Athene about the importance of data in today's environment and how the U.S. can win the battle for data dominance over its adversaries. And then we break down the Israel-Hamas ceasefire deal, the latest threats from Russia directed at NATO, and whether Chinese toy companies are using robot toys to spy on kids. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am pleased to welcome my colleague at the Times, Vaughn Cockayne, to the show this week. Vaughn is one of our most valuable team members here at Threat Status. You may have heard him a few weeks ago on the show with Guy Taylor in my absence. It's a pleasure to have you back, Vaughn. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks a ton for having me. I'm glad to be back.
All right, we'll get to our interview here in just a minute with Peter O'Donoghue and Deshawn Bell of the company Tyto Athene. Really good stuff on the 21st century battle for data dominance, a term that's often thrown around in national security circles. We'll dig into kind of what that actually means and how data really is becoming kind of almost the currency of military power in today's fast-moving, high-tech world. But before we get to that, Vaughn, first things first, what's on your radar this week?
On my radar this week, the first thing I want to talk about is these new Iranian oil sanctions announced by the U.S. Treasury and the State Department on Thursday this week. The sanctions are targeting 50 individuals, organizations, and vessels facilitating the transfer and sale of Iranian oil and liquid petroleum gas. The action is part of a larger maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration has been pressing over the past 9 months, aimed at sort of increasing as much pressure as possible on the Iranian government. These oil exports have really been the saving grace economically for Tehran, as they are, pressed upon even further through Western economic sanctions, through the snapback mechanism of the JCPOA or the 2015 Iran deal. Iran sells mainly to China, which has purchased at least 90% of its oil exports over the last 2 years, according to most estimates. And these new sanctions are targeting a series of Chinese-based teapot refineries and terminals that mostly receive oil shipments from these so-called shadow vessels or unregistered ships that ferry illicit materials like oil from heavily sanctioned regimes like Iran. These sanctions, are really broad, though. They don't just target Chinese-based oil refineries or terminals. They're also focused on targeting entities and companies in other countries like Bangladesh, the United Arab Emirates, and Singapore that help facilitate these oil revenues in Iran. And the other thing that I did want to talk about, I did want to bring up that we brought up earlier this week in the newsletter, is the OpenAI report detailing how malicious actors, some tied to U.S. adversaries, are using AI to facilitate their online scams. Specifically in the report released earlier this week, OpenAI cited examples where Russian and Chinese-linked networks use ChatGPT to assist in influence operations. In one instance, OpenAI cited a banning of a series of Chinese accounts that were using chatbots to develop ideas for a large system that could monitor social media conversations. Similarly, Russian-linked accounts were using ChatGPT to generate video prompts that would then be passed on to a different AI system to generate videos that could be used in an influence operation. Chinese groups were also involved in phishing scams where they would use ChatGPT to generate human-sounding emails to get individuals to reveal confidential information. OpenAI said, fortunately, a lot of these tactics used by bad actors were not new, but still they said that these actors are developing systems to make these AI prompts that they use seem like human-generated, removing M dashes and things like that. So there's a lot to watch out for when it comes to hackers and bad actors using AI technology in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's always fascinating. We talk a lot, of course, about AI on this show, and it's often through the prism of what defense companies are working on, or what folks sort of in that space are, how they're using AI to potentially make the U.S. military more efficient or improve our national security in some way or the other. There's always a flip side or an evil twin to some of these things, and this is one good example of that. I wanted to mention here quickly off the bat, you mentioned the Mideast a second ago, Vaughn. Of course, we have to talk about the Israel-Hamas peace deal announced by President Trump earlier this week. The first phase of that plan, which Israel and Hamas have both agreed to, would see Hamas release its remaining hostages, the living hostages and the remains, presumably, of those who are dead, to Israel starting this weekend or into next week, according to President Trump. Israel, in return, will pull back its forces in Gaza to a mutually agreed upon line, essentially scaling back or pumping the brakes, if you will, on its ground mission inside Gaza, which, of course, has become increasingly controversial around the world, including in the U.S. For President Trump personally, of course, this is great politics. There's more talk now about him receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. And to be honest, if this deal actually holds, I think he'll probably have a pretty good case for it. But it is worth keeping in mind there are a lot of unanswered questions here. The specific language is important. Israel is framing this as the first step in a ceasefire. In its statement, Hamas said that it is, quote, stipulating an end to the war in Gaza, and that part of the deal is that Israel will conduct a, quote, withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, unquote. So we'll see. But it's not the first time we've kind of been at the finish line, seemingly, only for things to fall apart at the 11th hour. President Trump deserves a ton of credit here, but as a lot of sources have been telling me this week, what reason do we really have to trust Hamas to live up to its word? So we'll see. But speaking of conflicts, of course, the president wants to end, and we highlighted this a lot in the Threat Status newsletter over the past couple of days, the U.S. weighing a proposal to send long-range Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Those missiles have a range of 1,500 miles or more. The distance of Ukraine, the entire country, from its western border with Poland to its eastern border with Russia, is 817 miles. So you can do the math on this one. The U.S. sending Tomahawks to Ukraine means that we are more or less encouraging them or tacitly giving them kind of a wink-wink nod situation to fire on targets deep inside Russia, potentially. And that's, of course, a bit of a change for the Trump administration, and it seems to reflect the frustration the president personally has had, in particular, in his dealings with the Russians. We've talked about that a lot on this show many times, and the Kremlin doesn't seem to care. In fact, one Russian lawmaker this week said that Russia could attack military bases in Poland if the U.S. gives Tomahawks to Ukraine. Now, look, and you know this well, Vaughn, there are inflammatory statements coming out of Moscow all the time. Former President Dmitry Medvedev has talked about nuclear weapons. Russian philosophers have talked about how Russia either wins its war in Ukraine or the world literally will end. Just some over-the-top stuff coming out of Moscow. But this I do take a little more seriously because we've talked recently about Russia's continued, or at least alleged continued, violations of NATO airspace in Poland, Romania, Estonia, and how that's sort of serving as a test of NATO, of the resolve of the alliance. This might be an extension of that. Is this the pretext, or would it be the pretext that would allow Russia to move beyond testing NATO to just outright attacking it? I'm a little skeptical that when push comes to shove, they'd actually do that. But I do think we're closer to that reality, certainly, than we were a couple of weeks ago. And that's potentially a very dangerous place to be. One final note before we get to our interview here. The Pentagon this week scaled back its proposed restrictions on reporters. We covered this in great detail on the show 2 weeks ago, and myself and my colleague Mike Glenn have been writing a lot about it. So if you need a bit of a primer or a refresher on this issue, go check out our coverage at the Washington Times or listen to the Threat Status podcast recently. The Pentagon Press Association is not happy with these proposed changes, and there's a lot of potential problems still inside of it. And again, you can read our coverage to get more detail on that. But it is worth noting that the Pentagon did drop the explicit requirement in writing that a journalist sign a document saying they won't report any information not authorized for release by the government or risk losing their press pass to the Pentagon. I think they should probably overhaul this document or get rid of it entirely and start from scratch. Most reporters, or virtually all reporters I talk to, agree with that. But I guess this is somewhat, a small victory, as they say. Vaughn, I'm curious now, speaking of hard passes, you have one, of course, at the State Department. Are you hearing anything about potential restrictions on reporters working there at State? What's the dynamic been like for you there in dealing with sort of the public affairs office at State?
It really hasn't been that restrictive, but I will say it's been a month and a half since the last public press conference led by Tammy Bruce. Obviously, the State Department has been fairly busy flying around the world trying to facilitate different peace deals. Obviously, the UN happened fairly recently, and basically every person who would lead a State Department press conference was there. But even still, we really haven't seen any kind of direct restrictions like we've seen or direct proposals for restrictions like we saw from the Pentagon to the State Department.
We'll be tracking this story, of course, moving forward here at Threat Status. And we are joined now by two fantastic guests. Peter O'Donoghue, the Chief Technology Officer, and Deshawn Bell, the Mission Technology Strategist, both at the company Tyto Athene. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us here on the Threat Status Podcast.
Great to be here, Ben.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. Thank you. So rather than me do it, just curious if one or both of you just want to give us and our listeners maybe just a quick 1 or 2 minute explainer about your company and what you all do there.
Sure. So Tyto Athene, we're a tech company, and we've got a global reach, right? We trace our history back to for over 60 years, and actually the core of the company was really born doing, I would say, like network modernization for the mission customer, right? So we've been supporting missions in Indo-PACOM, in Europe, overseas, and actually we've built like a lot of really good muscle memory in terms of what it takes to manage the program management, the logistics, and all the challenges of what it takes to deploy secure networking across the globe for our defense mission customers. I mean, that's where the company was born. Over time, we've been adding an awful lot of cyber capabilities and digital transformation capabilities, and because we've been serving those mission customers, understanding that intersectionality of enterprise IT, but also solving mission problems, I think has become stock and trade, and that's a major focus of the company right now. We're private equity held, which gives us, I think, an advantage in terms of resources, and actually our size is such that we can actually focus on being good at a few things as opposed to having to be good at all things all the time, everywhere, and forever, right? So and actually our core skills are around like network modernization, digital transformation, focusing heavily on mission tech right now, but also cyber, defensive cyber operations. And actually this year we've also specialized, and we just made an acquisition in the April timeframe of a company that was born to solve the FedRAMP problem. And we think, the automation capabilities that they bring are enormously relevant to, I would say, one of the biggest blockers right now that we're seeing across the mission, right? Which is how do we empower the warfighter to get access to mission leading technology and disruptive technology? So how do we do that, right? So we've got some super strong capabilities around basically taking friction out of the risk management framework process. And that's fundamentally who we are.
I want to zero in on kind of one big broad point here before we get into some more specifics. And I know Tyto Athene talks a lot about this idea of data dominance. We talk about it a lot here in the show, including recently. But I do wonder if it's one of those things that occasionally it's good to kind of step back and take a second here, in the 21st century to think about what it actually means and how folks who work in this space every day actually unpack the term data dominance and its significance for the U.S. military, for our partners, for U.S. national security. What does it mean from where the two of you? Is it we just talking about having more data than an adversary? Does it mean being able to process or analyze it in a better, more efficient way, or being able to use it in a way as a tool in a national security toolkit in a way that others do not? When we talk about data dominance, is there sort of a definition or a way that you all like to think about it?
Well, let me start, and actually I'll have Chief Bell kind of give his thoughts on the subject too. My definition of data dominance actually is actually quite simple, and I think what's really interesting, Ben, is is if you think of what's happened in the last 20 years, actually it's interesting. I've worked extensively with data engineers and data architects for over the many years, and actually it's kind of funny over major changes as the web happened, as the cloud happened. The continuous refrain I always get from some of my peers is it's always about the data. It's always been about the data, right? And actually, if you think of actually say the Pacific right now, and actually even like any government mission, but particularly the mission of Department of Defense, the amount of data that's being created and actually is available for mission uses, it's eye-watering the amount of information that's actually available. The data dominance basically means that the ability to understand what data is available, it means understanding the data, understanding the quality of the data, being able to trust the data. It means being able to get the data to the right mission commander at the right time for the right mission need, and then being able to exploit that data to make better, more timely, and better quality mission decisions. And actually, frankly, I would go as far as to say that we're in an arms race where the entity or the nation that is able to understand its data and exploit its data in the most efficient and the most expeditious and the highest quality manner actually will prevail in the next conflict, right? And if you think of what's happening in the Pacific, and actually we're up against an adversary, if you look at what's happening with DeepSeek and what they've been doing with LLMs, we're up against a pretty formidable competitor, right? So the ability to understand our data, get access to the data, proliferate data, put data in the right hands, and to be able to do it securely, and then being able to exploit that data for mission advantage is actually we consider ourselves to be purveyors in that value chain. And frankly, the areas that we're strongest at will be around, I would call it like the ubiquitous networking space and the ability to manage the data and proliferate that data as securely and safely as possible. That's really Tyto Athene's about.
Peter mentioned the arms race where the nation that best exploits the data assets will prevail. But I would argue, again, using the Pacific as a context, it's really the nation partners. And so what I do, I like to tell you a story, right? So I will change the name to protect the innocent. But the challenge with the information data, the dominance is to ensure that again, all the nation partners have access to relevant, up-to-date, actionable information. The story I want to share is when I was coming up in the working in the Pacific, the challenge we had when we had these various coalition exercises, we as the U.S., obviously, I feel we had the best technology, but the challenge we had is bringing that technology to share it with our partners. And because there was some risk associated with it, there's only so much we could share in terms of applications, hardware, network capabilities. So we were producing things in silos. So when we would have a common operational picture and we were, sharing it with our nation partners during the exercise, you could clearly see that the information was not being shared evenly distributed, or the data wasn't shared. It wasn't evenly distributed. It wasn't consistently up to date along the various nation partners. So you could see on the screen when we'd have a combination operational picture for the U.S. versus our nation partners, the icons that are on the screens were not synchronized. As you see troop movements, the troop movements that on the U.S. screen was different, was either lagged behind what the nation partners would see on their respective screens, or ours were ahead. So that even back then, it underscored the challenge of having the data dominance, to where I look at it as data dominance, where everybody has the same access to the information at the same time, relative to the given situation. So those commanders can make a synchronized decision based on having the most accurate, updated information.
Well, let's drill in a little more, since you mentioned the Indo-Pacific and the challenges specifically that presents. And of course, one of the biggest ones, and this is probably obvious to anybody who has Google Maps on their phone and can just look at the geography of that region, is the sheer distance that we're talking about here. I know it's top of mind for military planners thinking about on the physical side of things, moving materiel, personnel, ammunition, other equipment, all right. It's different than Europe. It's different than the Middle East, just because of the geography and the distances we're talking about. How does that translate to the data question? I mean, are there specific things, specific challenges you encounter with the great vast distances and the specific makeup of the Indo-Pacific in terms of data?
Yeah, I'll say from my perspective in the Pacific, the challenge we were is transporting that data. And so again, use the tyranny of distance, depending on where certain nodes were, where certain data repositories sat in the broad spectrum of the Pacific. For instance, if you had an exercise, you have nodes in Japan, you have nodes in the Philippines, you have nodes in Hawaii, you even had nodes in Alaska. So it really depended on where those key data assets were in those key nodes along the way, and then the network that was between those certain nodes to be able to transport information. And again, some of those transport problems were unique to our nation partners because maybe they didn't have the technological capabilities from a network perspective that we had to be able to transport the information.
It's interesting. I spent some time a few weeks ago down at NATO's Joint Force Command in Norfolk, Virginia, and they talk about a lot of the things that you just talked about, things you might not even think about in terms of what you have on a screen, making sure that all nations in the alliance are using that same sort of thing. Because if you're using different things and the data is different, or even when it comes down to an emblem or some kind of insignia or something like that, that can cause chaos, and you don't want that to happen during a mission or during a conflict, God forbid. So having all that stuff, uniform ahead of time is really important. We've kind of touched on this, and I want to drill into a little bit further. And Peter, I wonder if you might have some thoughts on this. In terms of getting data and information to folks where they need it, I'm wondering, is there a concern that we being the U.S. or our partners, I guess anybody really, are there areas where we're too reliant on, internet access and Starlink and networks and that sort of thing? Because I know there's been a movement that I've seen in the defense industry, especially over the past few years, but really accelerating recently, to build compartmentalized solutions for specific capabilities that can run without the internet or being on any kind of network. How do we find the balance? Because a lot of what we're talking about, I would assume, of course, is going to require connectivity in one form or another, but yet there are some things that maybe can be compartmentalized and don't need it. How do you find sort of the right balance and walk the tightrope on those two things?
Well, actually, that's a really good question. And I think the answer is, I'm probably going to answer it like a consultant, right? Which is it's more of an and response than an or response. Like when you think about supporting the war fight in the Pacific, right? I think you have to design for basically these kind of islands of automation that can work and that can be work and be managed, if you will, in a disconnected mode, right? So you have to assume that you're going to have to endure periods of time where you're disconnected. However, companies like us, though, with some of the investments that we're making in terms of research and development there's two or three major problems that we're kind of solving for, right? One is to recognize that there will be periods of disconnectedness, but also recognize that to Deshawn's point, the complexity of the tyranny of distance, right? Like recognizing that you've got a blend of undersea assets, you've got a blend of satellite assets, you've got a blend of 5G assets that are kind of floating around, or frankly on different islands. And how do I stitch together basically kind of a resilient, ubiquitous network where you've got like the notion of like digital twins, you're aware of where frankly your adversary has gotten and being able to compromise you, and being able to sense that and respond and actually use different transports and to be able to knit this together in a continuous manner. So solving for, to be as resilient as possible, solving for, you've got an adversary that is very sophisticated in terms of understanding what your assets are, and they'll want to actually kind of thwart you. But also making sure that you've got the right level of security, right? So philosophically, we're solving for, like, a lot of the legacy networks that we have were built to be isolated and to kind of live in their own kind of like domains of automation. There's a lot of in order to make like the the joint all-domain command and control concepts work, it does mean that data can flow freely across networks, right? So our role is to design and build resilient networking to be able to connect the points as necessary, and to be able to put the right zero trust type of overlays over top of that stuff, right? So that's fundamentally what we're trying to do. So you want data to be able to, as at the point of creation, you want to be able to make it available. You want actually people who are interested in that data to be able to consume it and recognize that. And you also want to have the orchestration and the automation so that your orchestration layer is aware of what's happening at the mission edge and also at the enterprise edge, so data can actually flow to the point that it needs as quickly as possible, right? And frankly, the other thing that we're solving for is interoperability challenges, right? So being able to make sure that you've got like major kind of solutions, data platforms, you got hardware platforms, and being able to make sure that data can actually flow across these different boundaries and get to the point they need is actually a major issue. And that's true from a data perspective and also at a voice command and control and a radio perspective as well. So this is the kind of space that we live in.
And if I could add to double on what Peter said about the interoperability, and you mentioned NATO, Ben. And so one of the things that we are keenly aware of is that NATO has a charter. The member nations of NATO, they have a charter. So there's some fundamental or foundational rules that they govern that helps bind what capabilities are going to commonly share. Well, in the Pacific, you just have a bunch of multiple bilateral agreements. So the agreement that the United States has with Japan does not always mesh, obviously, with Korea or even the Philippines or even Taiwan. And so those are some of the challenges that we have. And, again, to Peter's point about interoperability, it adds an additional challenge because of the bilateral agreements that you have. How do we establish a fundamental interoperability platform, if you will, to where all the nations can take advantage of it?
Well, a couple minutes left here, but last question, Deshawn. I want to follow up on that a little bit. Can artificial intelligence help with any of that, about maybe finding some of those areas where, hey, this is going to be a potential problem in terms of your interoperability with X nation down the road? This is something that you need to address. I mean, where can AI play a role in both that interoperability aspect, if at all, that you just mentioned, and also just the tyranny of distance question that you mentioned earlier? Where are there specific things that it can be able to do to help solve some of those challenges, either today or maybe at some point in the next few years?
I think what AI will do is it will identify the gaps and the challenges quicker to then allow us to, shore up those gaps, fill those gaps in a quicker manner. It's one of those things. AI will help us learn quickly. What is the saying? We don't know what we don't know. Well, AI will help us know what we don't know and then give us opportunity to solve the problems, not only for ourselves, but again, in terms of Indo-Pacific, to help bring along our nation partners, because, we're not going to fight these wars alone.
And when I think about AI, the way you're asking the question, Ben, I kind of look at it as both a means and an end, right? A lot of the reason we want to share this data is so that we can use artificial intelligence to be able to process it, and actually, to be able to do what we would just call basic sense making, right? So looking at images, looking at full motion video to be able to make sense of it. So actually you can actually drive mission advantage. So AI can be the ultimate why we're actually wanting to share data, but actually in the use cases and scenarios we talked about, what we're finding is actually there's some really promising exercises happening with the UK Navy right now, and they're able to show they're actually basically building a reference architecture, reference implementation of the type of solutions that we're adhering to ourselves, which is like secure data sharing across coalition partners. And actually, it's so far so really good in terms of the progresses that they made. But to go back to the actual question that you asked, we see AI helping with. There's a philosophical shift happening in terms of how data is going to be shared. We're going to rely less on heavy duty hardware, and we're going to use more software and automation. And AI is going to be used to tag a lot of our data, whether or not you're talking about videos, you're talking about images, or frankly, data itself. And within that, we'll be able to define what the security classifications are and who gets to see what data. So AI can be used extensively there. And actually, in the network orchestration solution I talked about, I mean, think of it as kind of like this orchestrator of orchestrators, where it's aware in real time terms that, hey, we've just lost terrestrial networking in island X, and we need to be able to fire up, a different way to actually move our data bits to an endpoint or to be able to pull it, right? So having an AI engine participate in being able to make decision making related to making sure our networks are resilient and we're being able to auto pace at the means necessary once you actually know that you're in a conflict, and being able to make the right kind of to make the right resolution, to be able to pivot so that actually you're using the transport options that are available and optimizing how data gets across your mission. We think AI is going to play a really important role there as well, Ben.
Peter O'Donoghue and Deshawn Bell from Tyto Athene, thanks to the both of you so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Great to be here, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where we identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world, that we think is impacting national security this week as you all are listening to the show. And my threat of the week is Chinese-made toys allegedly spying on young children. National security correspondent and friend of the show, Bill Gertz, had a piece this week about how the Justice Department fined the China-based toy maker Aperture Technology Company Limited and accused the company of violating the 1998 Children's Online Privacy Protection Act through its programmable toy robots. Now, the two sides reached a deal in which the company did not acknowledge officially or admit that it spied on kids with its toys, but the civil complaint filed against the company said that essentially the way this worked is that Aperture uses an app to operate these toys that move, like robots that are moving, and through an Android app controlling those toys, secretly collects geolocation data on children under the age of 13. In other words, they're gathering all kinds of information on kids about where they're going and what they're doing. Like, maybe this is happening in other instances. I'm sure it probably is at this point. But it's my threat of the week because when you hear things like this, it's just another reminder that China and China-linked companies, allegedly at least, seem to have virtually no bounds when it comes to their effort to collect data and information on literally everybody, Vaughn.
It's true. We really do see a lot of data collection stories coming out every single day, even from toys, it seems. Now, my threat of the week has to do with biosecurity, specifically this new Hoover Institution report detailing an emerging security threat concerning biotechnology. Our colleague, John Seward, talked to Drew Endy of the Hoover Institution, who notes massive advances in AI models and DNA printers mean that soon anyone will be able to source any deadly toxin or pathogen. And as he notes in his report, China is well ahead of the United States on this. He explained that China's whole of government approach to biotechnology has left the U.S. woefully unprepared to compete. In talking to our colleague, he said that we should establish a national biotechnology coordination office that would oversee the building of a federally funded AI lab dedicated to processing highly technical biological data. Now, obviously, this is really far in the future, really advanced stuff, but also extremely dangerous, this prospect of people being able to identify or really, map out these deadly or toxic pathogens. And the U.S. being behind China on this is also not something new in the defense sphere.
Yeah, no, it's frightening because, you read through that story from our new colleague, John Seward, and you read examples like Professor Endy saying that one of his peers in China says they were able to build a lab, just quickly within a very short period of time and hire 2,500 people to work on this kind of bioengineering, biosecurity issues. And he can't get money to bring a couple of PhD students on board to help him at the Hoover Institution at Stanford to do that kind of work. So that's a great real world example when we talk about China's whole of government and how they're direct government funding and essentially, they don't have the protections in place or the separation, if you will, between private sector research, academic institutions, and the government that we do here. And, that's in some ways obviously a bad thing, but I think in instances like this, it obviously helps them race ahead pretty quickly on some pretty dangerous technology. So thank you for that. And a huge thanks, of course, to John Seward as well for that great piece. Vaughn, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming and joining me here in the Threat Status Podcast. A big thanks to Peter O'Donoghue and Deshawn Bell from Tyto Athene. And a big thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share the podcast with all of your friends, and we'll be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.